So, hello everyone. Thank you for coming and welcome at this distributed keynote session titled More Than Human Knowledge and Data in Artistic and Practice-Based Research, which is actually the one and only hybrid event that we have at the festival that is also happening online. Most of the festival this year is happening here in the premises of Petrohradská Collective in Prague. And we have, this is more info for the online audience, we have exhibition here full of interactive installations as well as all kinds of live acts like performances and rituals and all kinds of audio visual narratives at the festival, which this year is kind of revolving or looping around the theme feral bodies, synthetic rituals, through which we are proposing to investigate and experiment with the so-called feral ways of knowing and making sense with more than human ecologies, so with all kinds of other than human creatures that we share the world with, including animals, plants, spirits, algorithmic agencies, computational systems, etc. So this session really aims to provide a space for sort of more in-depth discussion about these themes and invites 3 practice-based researchers coming from various fields, including multisensory art, participatory design, and human-computer interaction, to talk about how they experience, understand, and work with the knowledge and data that emerges from their creative work with various more than human ecologies. So in the session, we would really like to look at how more than human co-creation of knowledge and data can look and feel like, or even taste and smell like in practice, and what kind of challenges might be involved. And really, what is the data that emerges from this kind of practice-based work? How can it be shared and communicated so it captures the sort of substantial breadth of the more than human experience that is involved in this kind of co-creation. So at the festival we talk a lot about the practices of being with, living with, sensing with other than human creatures, growing relations, growing partnerships, coalitions, which can look very differently in different contexts, of course, depending, for instance, on what other than humans are involved. So in this session, we would like to bring these topics sort of on the ground and discuss them together with the 4 guests that we have today and let them kind of introduce their own practice to give us examples of how does this co-creation, how can it look in specific practice. So we have 4 speakers today, which Enrique Encinas, the co-moderator of this session, will now kindly introduce.
And I will introduce you, Marketa Dolejova, also.
Hello.
As co-curator. So the 4 guests that we have today, in no particular order, but I will start right next to me with Jaz Choi. He's an associate professor in civic interaction design at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Their transdisciplinary, experimental, multisensory, and very playful research and practice situate care at the core of transformational encounters in different settings, ranging from cities as complex cyber-physical networks to forests as moving creatures. Their current research focuses on the dynamics of creative practice as feral care. You can experience Jaz's work as part of the Open Forest Collective by checking out right here and exploring their cabinet of feral data curiosities. Right here we have Tereza Stehlíková. Tereza Stehlíková, I'm sorry. Yes. Is an artistic researcher working in Czech and the UK. Her work is cross-disciplinary, investigating how moving image can be used to communicate embodied experiences. She's the head of the Visual Arts Department in the University of Creative Communication in Prague, and also founder of the Sensory Sites Collective, based in London, that explores multisensory perception and bodily experience. And she also launched the online arts journal Tangible Territory that features essays and articles centered on the role our senses play in creating meaning in art and life. On the screen, we have Louise Juul Søndergaard, There is a postdoctoral researcher in interaction design at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. And through her research and creative practice, she explores how design can support more caring relations to the body, to communities, and to the environment. She specifically focuses on the design of intimate technologies in the domains of health and well-being. And her research raises important questions related to the intersections of gender and sexuality with technology use and development, as well as social, ethical, and environmental issues of emerging technologies such as conversational agents, wearables, robots, and AI. Finally, we have Simone Niquille, that is a designer and researcher based in Amsterdam. Her practice, Technoflash Studio, investigates the representation of identity and the digitization of biomass in the network space of appearance. Currently, she's investigating the architectural and bodily consequences of computer vision, researching the politics of synthetic training datasets. So, I guess we go to our first speaker, which
Let's
will
do that.
be...
So just maybe to, wow, we have a lot of participatory involvement of the audience in all kinds of multisensory ways already happening. But yes, so just to give you a very brief overview of how the session will be structured, we will have a short 10 to 12 minutes, or maybe even longer, contributions from the 4 speakers, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions after or share your reflections after each of the talks. And then at the end of the session, we will have time to go a little bit more depth into the discussion. So please feel free to ask questions, or please ask questions if you feel like that. And with that, I think I will pass the imaginary way, pass the microphone to Maria Louise, who will start with her contribution.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen.
It seems to be working.
It seems to be paused now. It is since my screen sharing is paused.
Very feral.
I'll just try to share it again.
Maybe try again. We saw the slides, but in the speaker view.
Okay.
Yes, it's working now.
Okay.
Perfect.
It seems to be working. Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction. And it was lovely to see all the bubbles. Even from here, I can imagine it was really nice in the air where you are in Prague. Yes, so thank you also for inviting me to this keynote panel. I'm really excited for seeing the presentations and the conversations we'll have. So yeah, my name is Maria Louise. I'm with you from Oslo in Norway. My pronouns are she, her. And it's a bit dark and rainy here now. Enrique might know this darkness feeling here, but I've heard actually just a few 1-2 kilometers from here up in the mountains there's snow. So hopefully I'll get to that tomorrow. But today I'm here to talk about my experience and work with being absorbed in mosses. But my research didn't really start with mosses. It actually started more being absorbed in menses or in menstrual blood. So for more than 20 years, I've been menstruating, and a lot of my research and practice actually started with exploring experiences of the body, the human body, and its leaky fluids into the world. So it comes from a very different perspective than the non-human or the modern human in itself. And so some examples of previous works include like designing menstrual cups that are connected to the internet that shares data of when you're menstruating online, or soft robotics that sort of tracks behavior or pain from the body and feed this back to you in forms of massage on your body. And more broadly, different intimate technologies that come close to the body or even inserted into the body, such as sex toys. But this talk is then this turn that I have done from menses to mosses, and from moving from the purely sort of human body to the non-human bodies, and zooming in on some of these relations between human bodies and non-human bodies, and these ecologies, these more than human ecologies that we are entangled in. And this fascination that I got with mosses started with this finding this product, this sanitary napkins that was made out of this particular moss species called sphagnum moss, which is the moss you see on the right side here. It's an absolutely incredible species of moss because it has the ability to absorb up to 25 times its own weight in liquids. And that's why it has been used throughout history as a material to absorb menstrual fluids. But there's very little documented knowledge on this, actually. But then later, people tried to capitalize on this moss through selling these products, but it's not something that we see today. What we mostly see is these polluting menstrual products that includes a lot of plastics. So, for instance, the plastic tampon applicator that is, of course, designed with some hygiene reasons, but also in many cases because of this kind of taboo and fear for many people of getting really close to their menstruating body, which in some places is perceived as a dirty body. So I got more and more concerned, I guess, for some of these polluting aspects of the things that we design and the technologies we design, and also how it contributes to pollution in the world, and how this then feeds back into our bodies. So I started learning about the ways, for instance, air pollution is leading to menstrual irregularities and problems with like low weight babies that are being born and so on. So these are some of the concerns that's made me interested in these practices of modern human design and practices of like modern human bodies. So both what we insert into our bodies and what we insert into other non-human bodies, and not thinking of our body as a contained body, but something that is leaky and porous, and something that is absorbing and being absorbed by other bodies. So the first practice project I want to present and talk about is the project Biomenstrual, which I developed with Nadia Campo-Wojtok, my collaborator and friend. And in this project, we tried to look into the menstrual blood, and not only as a liquid, but like looking at the fertile aspect of menstrual blood that has nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, and can work as a fertilizer for soil. As seen here, yeah. So we imagine this cyclical process of harvesting species such as sphagnum moss from different ecologies, creating one's own menstrual pads, bleeding on them, and then feeding them back into the soil where they would compost into a rich soil. And here we designed with different kinds of species. So we worked with gluten, for instance, to create this spongy pad. We worked with the sphagnum moss and learned about that. We worked with seaweed to create these bioplastic sheets. And then we continuously in these products worked with red cabbage, the red cabbage liquid, which works kind of as an analog pH sensor, to demonstrate this really interesting link of pH value between the vagina and sphagnum moss, which actually has kind of the same pH range, which was for us at least like a fascinating relation between the vagina and moss. both of them are between 3.5 and 4.5 pH. So in the acidic level. So the sphagnum moss has these amazing qualities, like the pH value, which is the same as the vagina, and also it has antibacterial values. And these were all things that I did not know going into this project. Learning about mosses was like part of the key aspects, and we were trying to learn about the mosses, the different species, at the same time as, for instance, also training this machine learning algorithm and seeing different kinds of mosses. So, for instance, if you go into the forest and see just like the green carpet, it can be hard to distinguish different species, right? And we were trying to play around with this also with the computer. And some of the videos play a bit not so smooth, but yeah, I apologize for that. We played around also with data sets of fertility sensors, where we were kind of fascinated about this Google search. When you just search for fertility sensor, you see images showing fertility sensors of soil, as well as fertility sensors for reproductive or menstruating bodies. And it has this kind of fascinating or in some way also troubling relation of the word of fertility in different bodies. So here we use this data set to create this video of morphing images of different kinds of fertility sensors. And you don't know exactly what kind of bodies these are measuring the fertility data of, but it has these wide range of more green ecologies and more these like product devices, technologies. And then, of course, a lot of different creatures would be part of these kind of practices. This, so it includes, for instance, on the left image here, you can see the tardigrade. It's this micro animal which loves living in sphagnum moss. So how would it feel to wear this moss, where knowing that you're sort of like also carrying around the lives of these micro animals? And on the second image, you see the earthworms that would be part of these composting practices. And we're speculating here on like the human interventions in the soil in this case. Would these non-human creatures flourish by the menstrual blood, or not at all? And it sort of steered into a lot of different other explorations of biodegradable menstrual cups, other non-human species that also menstruate, such as dogs, and these workshops where we look closer on the mosses through a microscope. So the second project that I wanted to just briefly present here towards the end is a project that is called I Moss You. And it's a video that I created for the exhibition called Fabulation for Future, which is an online exhibition. So I'll show you a little clip of the video, but since it doesn't work perfectly, you can go to the website later and check it out. So it's a video that is exploring or showing different kinds of mosses and continuing telling these stories of mosses, but as seen through a microscope. So getting really, really close to this small being. I'll share just 1.5 minutes of this with you.
Hvor er jeg? Det sidste jeg husker er jordens varme og luftens fugt. Der voksede vi langsomt og stille i så mange år. Hvordan forvandlede jeg mig fra skovens grønne tæppe til en lille enhed et mørkt sted?
Almost 500 million years ago, the first plant arrived on land. The plant we came to know as moss. Without roots and mostly consisting of water, Moss thrives in humid and wet environments. The forest ground, the surface of a rock, the edge of a lake. Here mosses live, purifying the water we drink and the air we breathe. Being small is how moss simply survives. Being small, yet everywhere on Earth. But with man's desire to penetrate the atmosphere for space travel and interstellar living, where will moss go? Where will I go? With a touching closeness to these little green beings, we are invited into their worlds.
So it was a bit choppy, as you saw here. But yeah, so this is like the introduction of the film, and then following this, we meet some other moss species, the sphagnum moss, as I introduced you to, but also some other species called tetraphes, and another moss called Catherine moss. The first moss, which has a special characteristics of being air polluting sensing, and the other one, which has some very special characteristic of how it reproduces. And then we also see this micro animal, the rotifer, in the video. Yes, so when I'm saying absorbed in mosses, it's I guess it's both in the very literal way of working with it tangibly, but also like thinking of these stories and values and qualities which it's living and simply being, such as its omnipresence and its small and quiet and slow life. How I myself came to think of them as something, or not even see them, just like overlooking them, I guess, in the forest, to being so close to them through the microscope that it has this almost like passionate relation to them. And it's about the layers of transformation with them and the temporalities with which they live. Yeah, and with that, I would like to say thank you for listening to this, and looking forward to the other presentations.
Perhaps the audience has one question for Maria-Louise.
But first, thank you so much, Maria-Louise.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, any immediate questions from the audience here in Petrohradska? Andrej.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, I understand the speculative nature of your projects, but to me it doesn't seem like feeding tardigrades with your menstrual blood is a good idea, like putting that kind of microorganisms into your body. Is it safe, or is it necessary somehow, or what's the point?
So, I mean, thank you for that question. That's like, I guess that's one of the provoking questions that is asking, and also by showing it in this microscopic images. I mean, the tardigrades are everywhere, including on my eyelashes right now. It's just a microscopic animal we don't really see. So I'm not sure if it's safe or healthy or not, but I think it's asking some of those questions. Like, for instance, many of the pads that I could be using right now, tampons, they're not safe, they're not healthy, but that's the options that are there. So a lot of those things we don't see, and this project definitely puts it a bit more on the edge for us to think about some of those relations.
Thank you very much, Maria-Louise, for the question. So
Thank you.
So now we go to our next speaker. Oh, well, yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
That was the applause from our eager
Yes.
audience again. I hope you heard it, Maria-Louise.
Transition moment, yes. Different way to celebrate.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Maria-Louise. And if we can ask Simone now to take the stage and share her work.
Let's share the screen. I assume you hear me?
Yes, we can see it, we can hear you.
Perfect. All right, great. Well, thanks for having me. I see Marie-Louise and everyone on screen, so it feels like a very intimate presentation, and I understand it's not. But anyways, that's the joy of the hybrid. I just wanted to share a very chaotic overview of ongoing works and sort of motivations of my practice. I think, just as a sort of kickoff, most of my work is somehow dealing with a camera. So mostly interested in different ways of seeing, and that would be sort of computational photography and computer vision specifically. And I mean, the creature, sort of the character you're looking at here is part of a work in progress called Duck Rabbit. And we'll get to who Duck Rabbit is. And I think to, in some way, again, very messy, very chaotically, in 10 minutes, sort of contextualize some of the projects. Kodak in 1888, together with a camera called the Brownie, launched this sort of slogan that, you push the button, we do the rest. They still use it to this day. Also, this button from the late 80s was using it to sort of advertise new Kodak software. And the reason why I'm showing it is more, I'm really interested in this part of what's the rest, right? So within these ideas of capturing reality, taking photos, something that is really embedded in smartphones now as well, and not just in sort of very dedicated large sort of photographic equipment. The accessibility, I think, of photography really also changes the practice as is. To get back to Duck Rabbit, back and forth, Duck Rabbit's based on this little drawing by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's borrowed it from an illustrator who made this really beautiful drawing about two characters, right? So like on the one hand, it's a rabbit, and if you turn the same drawing 90 degrees, it starts looking like a duck. And Wittgenstein was interested in this as an illustration of what he would call seeing as or seeing that. So like different contextualizations, different information that a viewer might have, a subjectivity that you bring to your subject, that entirely changes the way you perceive or interpret the world around you. I think to some extent, I think there's a certain maybe banality in that. Like, yeah, sure, I, interpret something differently because of the inherent knowledge that I carry with me. But at the same time, the things that I am interested in is when does that get lost when some of these processes become computational. So again, sort of thinking of computational photography and computer vision, where there's other agents involved in this act of seeing, some of that context, some of that sort of common sense and prior knowledge might either be obscured or completely forgotten and inaccessible. This sort of image to very briefly contextualize computational photography. One way to talk about it would be literally the camera that you carry around on your smartphone. The fact that we still call it a camera, the things that the producers are called photos, but of course they're like vastly different from this sort of, lens-based apparatus that a camera was together with like a film. And the reason that makes it so different, right, is that sort of the processes that happen in taking a photo are much more advanced. So the thing here is a screenshot from a presentation from 2018 from an Apple event where they introduced the iPhone, the small iPhone XS. And one of the first times where it would carry a neural engine. So it had a much higher computing power within the small device of an iPhone. And so when you would take a photo, it would start 1 trillion operations. So again, thinking back to like the Kodak slogan, right, sort of what would be the rest? In this case, it's like 1 trillion operations that happen that you never really are aware of. And the ones that I'm most interested in are the ones sort of circled in green, which are CGI based, sort of computer generated imagery that is involved there, or either bits and pieces that are part of that image workflow, like the last one being either segmentation or depth image, like showing the virtual distance within an image. And at that, also this like weird conflation of like real, unreal, does that question still apply? Like at what point is an image simulated, at what point is it constructed, and at what point is it still like captured? Of course, recent AI tools play a big role in that too. I think way they've become accessible and sort of part of the wider way of creating imagery is to some part helpful in being able to discuss them critically. What we're looking at here is this idea to depixelize. I think sometimes it's referred to as different things, like it can either be depixelizing or like upscaling, upresing. So like adding information to an image to create more clarity, more resolution. What you're looking at here is like on the left will be the input image. So it's sort of highly stylized, pixelated, kind of drawing that resembles a face. And on the right would be the ideal outcome, where suddenly, it's become a human figure. Of course, these are sort of kind of hilarious, but at the same time, we can immediately see them also being applied in very different contexts, right? Something that might be artistic, but at the same time also maybe a surveillance context where you have a very low-res footage and you want to understand it, bring clarity to it. And with it, of course, it brings this idea of like, where does the information come from that's added to these pixels, right? What's the training data? What's the models that are actually adding and interpreting the pixelated image? And this one here caught a lot of fire on social media, as really an example of a racist and a ethically biased algorithm, specifically for this case, which was involved in the research paper of Face Depixelizer, where it pixelated what, at least to me, clearly looks like the headshot of Barack Obama, becomes this sort of white person when it gathers resolution and becomes higher resolution. And I think the discussions there obviously are embedded within algorithm and algorithmic justice, algorithmic image generation, as in, who's training these things, what's the training data that's being gathered, and to what use are they being put. And I think an example like this only puts to show that it works well, right? As in, it really shows its flaws and its racial biases very, very well. But of course, the problem that arises is, okay, this has been developed in an academic context, but what are the intentions and the applications of this in a wider scale, in a wider context? So the thing that I really sort of critically, engage with and DuckRabbit, I think, is trying to be against, is machine learning as this very sort of clean and mathematical apparatus, this idea that numbers don't lie, right? Sort of saying, sure, numbers might not lie in terms of them being very racist and discriminative in terms of the Barack Obama picture. But at the same time, the way that they might be applied in society can be extremely harmful and violent. And so my sort of starting point and the character of DuckRabbit is trying to take a queer stance in that and sort of saying, hey, computer vision is a technology of reading and of decoding who you want to be. In what ways can you evade that, right? In which ways can you be duck or rabbit? In which ways do you actually need to conform? And what are the standards and privileges embedded in moving with and cohabiting through computer vision? This example here, I mean, again, I think there's like a really thin edge between some of these examples and some of these technologies being absurd, and that absurdity being hilarious, or that absurdity being violent. This one here is a really good example at showing the effects of training data on the ways of seeing. So what you're looking at is, on the one hand, an image that's being read by a model called ResNet 101, to which the image looks like different kinds of fish, right? Like a tiger shark, a hammerhead, a great white shark, a garfish, or a sturgeon. And on the other hand, the same image read or looked at by Bagnet, sorrel is a type of grass. And then the other kinds, the Ibiza hound, Basenji, gazelle, and ox, they're either types of dogs or types of animals like a gazelle or an ox that have that color fur, like a brown, whitish fur. And so what we see emerge is that on the one hand, you have a training data set based on shape, and on the other, a training data set based on texture. And of course, the way they're being trained, the information that they're being fed really determines how they look at the world, in this case, just this one image. And that, of course, I think can take different shapes. And one thing I'm really interested in is what it means to cohabit with computer vision technology. So what happens when these technologies are being added to, these kind of gadgets that are supposedly creating this kind of smart home environment. The one we're looking at here, this is a movie from 2018-17 by a company called Boston Dynamics, which up to that point was like mostly famous for making these fairly creepy robots for the American defense sector. One was called Atlas. It was like a humanoid that was really good at carrying heavy loads and heavy packages. And Boston Dynamics as a company at that time was part of Google. They've been bought up by a different conglomerate at this point. But they came up with this sort of robot called Spot Mini at the time, saying that they were inspired by the offices that Google had, so the architectural qualities, which of course are kind of famous for being domestic, right? So Google trying to create workspaces that were very sort of, on the one hand, inviting, at the same time also would really make you stay there and make you work, became these spaces that were neither office, neither home. And so Boston Dynamics thought, hey, this is actually a perfect environment for a robot dog. Like, why isn't there this sort of servant that would automatically, function within these spaces with you? And so this is why they came up with Spot Mini. And what we're looking at in the video is them showcasing how well it works in a domestic environment. And so the thing I was super curious of is simply like, what's the training data set that's assembled to define something as subjective as a domestic space or as a home, right? Like, what's the home, which to me at least seems incredibly difficult to define, to something that would need certain parameters and boundaries, like a computer vision training data set. And already the scene in the kitchen, like where the thing is putting stuff in the dishwasher and in the trash, like that's such a subjective category, right? Like, how do you know that one's trash and one's dirty dishes? How do you actually, this scene here, like, how do you define these boundaries? So what I started doing is just remodeling the house that we saw in the video in Blender 3D software. And one thing that I immediately realized is that I didn't need to model anything. Like, everything was so standardized in the real world that the things that I needed virtually to remake it were readily available in any sort of asset library. So the house itself is a floor plan similar to houses that were sold through catalogs in the US in like the beginning of the 1900s. Like they were called Sears homes. And all of the furniture was, well, pretty much everything except for like two pieces was from IKEA. And if you look on Google Maps, you see that Boston Dynamics is really close to, Boston Dynamics, the company, is really close to IKEA in their Boston, Massachusetts headquarters. So I think there's, probably, we can only assume, because the training data set's not accessible, this being a private company, but my assumptions then kind of led me to think all of this probably is just accessibility and kind of happenstance, right? Like, hey, I'm training a robot in terms of what a home is. I need to assemble this kind of scenography to show its abilities off. Let me just go grab a bunch of chairs. And so grabbing a bunch of chairs just becomes shopping at IKEA. And my own assumptions about how this process functions led me down this kind of rabbit hole of looking into training data sets for computer vision within indoor spaces and the domestic space. At the same time, these kind of news items were appearing, like this one here, really sensationalist sort of headline, like South Korean woman's hair eaten by robot vacuum cleaner as she slept, really giving like tons of agency to this robot vacuum cleaner, right? As if it like consciously made a choice that it's going to need to somehow harm this woman. Whereas I was so much more interested in the fact that she's sleeping on a futon, right? It's like a non-Western bed that you would find if you just go to Boston, Massachusetts, IKEA. And at the same time, perhaps, you know, there's different rituals at hand. There's different patterns at hand in terms of sleeping, working, etc., that were entirely assumed by the engineers. So it's not so much a robot, but it's much more the engineers' assumptions, I think, that are eating this woman's hair, get tangled in her hair. And it's a standardization or Western viewpoint in this sense, at least, of what a domestic space is supposed to look like, and what kind of information this robot needs to function well. And at the same time, of course, also customers' extreme sort of frustration at the Roomba sort of automated cleaning robot that couldn't recognize poop. So instead of recognizing it and cleaning it, or at least avoiding it, it would just roll over it. And then this is one of these like really beautiful maps that people would create of the traces that the cleaning robot would leave throughout their house, smearing all of that feces all over their place. So really doing quite the opposite of cleaning. But again, the sort of frustration of the robot's intelligence, right? Like, why can't it recognize this thing that's like obviously dirty? The only thing it was supposed to do is clean, and it's doing the opposite. So sort of the object, or the other than human thing I'm mostly interested in is a camera, and specifically the computational camera. And what it sort of came down to is that domestic data, or the way the home is defined for computer vision, comes down to synthetic data. And what that means is 3D models of objects and floor plans that are virtually assembled into possible sort of configurations. I mean, imagine like The Sims, you know, really, it looks really similar, as we'll get to see in terms of modeling possible homes. And the reason it's synthetic is simply because there is no access in terms of privacy to people's homes, right? So there's no way to connect enough 2D, enough sort of captured image data of people's homes to be able to create a significant amount of data for training data sets. So synthetic, or like 3D data, until now at least, has been a huge answer to that technical problem. And so this is more sort of looking at how these things are kind of assembled. They're not like neat spaces, right? They really look like stuff has just been thrown into a room. And this is what sort of the generation algorithm would do, right? It just kind of knows, it's this floor plan that's labeled living room. So there's a possibility that there's XYZ objects in this space, and it kind of just randomly places it. And then there's a camera, a virtual camera that moves 3D spaces, generates a film, a movie, and the frames of that movie then become the training data set. And so diving deeper into one data set that I had access to, which was an academic research, which is called CNET RGPD. And this is done by the Dyson's Robotics Lab at Imperial College in London. Really gave me access to a lot of that language and the terminology and the etymology that's part of these training data sets. So on the one hand here, the way that floor plans would be categorized. So you'd have like a bedroom, an office scene, kitchens, living rooms, bathroom. I think already like really hinting at huge assumptions of how people live, right? That like everyone, or everyone, but at least a large part of the population would live in architectural spaces that are divided into these kind of typologies. At the same time, these lists of categories of objects, I've just highlighted a few. One, you know, I'm like, why is an iPod not a media player? Like, what's the distinction there? At the same time, you'd have a gun and a sword and a toy. Like, when is the gun and the sword a weapon, and when is it a toy? Again, where does the data come from that there is such a proliferation of some of these items as well? And looking at different ways of rendering. So what I do in my practice often is either writing, or I make films and animations where I use the technology that I talk about. So it's a little bit of a very inflicted position I take as well, where to understand and to research I need to make. And so part of that is also using the different maybe ways of seeing the different layers you render in CGI and using them as a final outcome. And that sometimes isn't necessarily what you're supposed to do. So here what you're looking at is a depth image. So you're not necessarily seeing a gun, you're just seeing the distance from the virtual camera into virtual space. But because there being an object, right, that object kind of appears through the rendering of distances. But at the same time, looking at the object rendered through a different view, the view that would be expected, the one where there's textures and there's lights, and there's an environment, a different kind of reality might appear, right? Where something that looks like a gun suddenly may or may not be a water pistol. In the same training data sets, there were these 4 different office scenes, and the top right one I was really struck by, which is this one here. And so something they were interested in getting sort of a high resolution, like high information of what a domestic space is also adding texture to these objects. And so what you're looking at here is literally the folder for projection surfaces. So there's 2 images in the projection surfaces, and they're both from right-wing news TV stations in the US called Fox News. Again, how much of that is intentional, how much of that is kind of happenstance, or just someone, needing right now random images of what a TV could be going through their Facebook timeline and just pulling down an image, and that now happens to be sort of a major training data set for indoor spaces. Similar complications arise in something as mundane as a chair, right, where you have models that clearly absolutely are not supposed to be in there. Armchair, straight chair, but none of those to a human being are that. These objects as 3D objects are entirely stripped of their context and of their relationality once entered into these training data sets, and they just become a thing, right? So I have these interviews in my research, and one of the computer engineers was super upset because he was saying, well, I made this like computer vision system and all it was seeing is toilets. It was like completely overfitted with toilets, and the whole entire world just kept on looking like toilets to it. So it's these sort of inherent frustration, almost similar to, I think, the map of poop that we saw of Roomba, right, that become really human, but at the end of the day also mean that the labor involved in training these data sets isn't as, well, not just thought out, but also like what are the consequences and what are the processes behind that? Are there checks and bounds? Is there documentation? Is there annotation to where the data comes from, where it lands, and what you're actually intending to do with it? Or is it all just like a big random jumble that suddenly becomes a product on market? So a current video I'm working on now is sort of the 3rd in a series, and I'm going back to the IKEA chair. This one here is called Bertel. It's like the first chair IKEA digitized and the first image render that appeared in their IKEA catalogs. I think at this point, almost the entire IKEA catalog is rendered rather than photographed. But this chair was the first time where they tried to like smuggle in a rendered image and no one noticed. So this sort of set off their whole entire shift to 3D rendering their products rather than photographing them. And to me, IKEA is interesting because of their magnitude and their shift to CGI. Does that mean that now suddenly all of their catalog being digitized is this sort of training data set waiting to be used? It's going to standardize the world of computer vision, but also perhaps the world of cohabiting with computer vision even more. Like if you want your thing to work, you need to have a Bertel. You can't just have a thing to sit on. Like the chair now is only a product that looks exactly like this. And so what I'm doing in this last film is simply
Simone,
training
I'm super sorry to
chair.
interrupt, but we will
Yes.
still turn on. Yeah, you should wrap up.
Yeah, this is the last slide.
Cool.
So the last work is literally teaching a chair to sit and trying to explore what it means to use ML agents and machine learning agents to teach something that is obviously anatomically not supposed to do these kind of movements, all of that in the virtual space. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for that. Do we have some quick questions? Immediate question from the audience? If we don't, I think we can move to the next speaker and then save the questions for the end. So the next speaker we have is Tereza. I'm going to pass you the stage like this.
Thank you. So I've got a slide show. Okay, so I want to just very sort of briefly introduce myself and my research practice. So my background's actually visual arts. I'm originally a filmmaker, but I've become very interested in sensory perception and the role of embodiment. In my PhD, I've been looking into how to evoke tactility in moving image. And then sort of naturally, I become interested in the sort of performance, participatory performance. And so this is one of the projects I want to share with you today. It was a project that happened just in June this year as part of the Prague Quadrennial. And it was basically a way of working with a physical location, so with a place. So that would be my kind of non-human participant. And that's part of my ongoing sort of research interest, is exploring this sort of interconnection between these internal sort of psychology, mental sort of realities and external topographies. And so if you can have the next slide. So the project was basically, it was called the Infraordinary Lab, and I'll explain what that means, why I use that word. But basically the location of the performance was in Holešovická tržnice, which basically people from Prague know that it used to be an abattoir, so it was a slaughterhouse. So it has this very sort of dark history. It was built in 1895, I think, and it was a way of trying to get the city to have a kind of centralized slaughterhouses, and it was to do with sort of industrialization of these sort of slaughters of animals. So it is a very fascinating place. Later it became it was discontinued as a slaughterhouse around 1980s, and then it basically turned into this kind of market, like fruit and vegetable market. Then there was a Vietnamese community moved in there, and now there is this sort of process of gentrification. So all of these sort of layers of history are there at the moment in this kind of mishmash of realities. If you can have the next slide. Can I have the next slide? Oh, thank you. Yes, so infraordinary. So what I've been very interested in this project is to sort of look for like alternative narratives. So to sort of forget the mainstream narrative, but look at things that are sort of not the obvious. And so the term infraordinary actually comes from Georges Perec's book, The Species of Spaces. It's a French writer who basically, there's a sort of section in his book where he talks about the sort of why are we so fascinated with the extraordinary all the time? Why we always on the news, we only have the spectacular, the sort of terrible, but what about this sort of magic of the everyday? You know, what about the way the city works? What happens if you just stand on a junction and watch things and really think about why our house is numbered this way and not another way, and so on. So that was a kind of inspiration for this project also, to look at the infraordinary aspects of this place and to try and get people sort of out of the central zones into the peripheries. So if I could have the next slide. So what was very important part of this project was the developmental phase. So for me, the development phase is always extremely important. It took, so I deliberately wanted it to take a long time, or like to take place over time. So this took basically a year of meeting there from like, I don't know, every 1 month, then it became more regular with a group of people. So it was very collaborative as well, very inclusive with my students, with anyone who wanted to join. And it was basically, the idea was to get to know the place across different seasons, get to know it slowly over time, get to know it intimately, and basically see what happens, to sort of allow the place to reveal itself. So part of my methodology that I've been using for a long time now is sensory, I call it sensory workshops. So it's basically trying to focus on senses as well, you know, as vision and sound, which are our dominant senses, to also think about smell, touch, kinesthesia, proprioception, interoception, so the way we sort of experience the internal processes in our body. So if we could have the next slide. So that's part of the documentation from these group workshops. Sometimes I had like a guest people, such as like dancers working with us, so that we would get different kind of input about experiencing the place. Can I have the next one? Yeah, so this was also part of the sort of developmental phase of just trying to get people to sort of heighten their other senses, so to go to a place that you might experience differently if you actually don't see it, because when you blindfold yourselves, everything immediately transforms. Things become much more intriguing and be very dominated by vision. So it's actually a very kind of simple tool of getting one's attention sort of reframed. If you could have the next. And of course, vision was also part of this project. So I was very interested in so I'm kind of the opposite of probably the other presenters here, extremely low-tech sort of interventions. So basically as low-tech as you can get. Basically a paper tube to kind of frame point of view, and really working with the body. But I'll explain that a bit more in the next. So if you could have the next one. Next slide. So this is now the performance. So the performance was sort of created in a form of a, well, we called it laboratory, but it was basically this table, or a couple of tables, and we had these Petri dishes on them, and what we did is that we basically collected bits of rubbish in the area, or we got people for us to bring these bits, and we just put them in these Petri dishes. And the Petri dish was just a way of basically giving these fragmented bits a different form of attention, so they would be sort of framed as well. And it was actually amazing how people became totally intrigued by them, and they treated them as if they were some sort of very special, expensive samples of something, or artwork, where actually it was just bits picked up from the street. And we found all kinds of things. So that was all part of this idea of this infraordinary, of sort of reframing the the ordinary stuff, giving it a different status. So when people came on this walk, they would get this map that you can see on the right slide, and they would get basically just, they would have their own headphones, and they got access to a set of tracks, which would be numbered on the map. And so it was very, very basic. And they would just go in their own pace to the right point and play the track. If we can have the next slide. And basically the idea here was to get people to connect with, so both with the location and also with their own bodies, and sort of really draw these connections between the two. Because the idea was, how do we sort of experience a place more deeply? How do we connect with it more viscerally? So for example, here was a stop number 3, and the building behind that you can see is it used to be a hide storage. So basically where the animal skins would be hung to dry. So again, I wanted the people to think about the history, but also think about their own skins, and sort of think about them as the threshold between their bodies and the kind of inside and outside. So that was like an example of it. If you can have the next. And here, this stop was quite powerful, because what you see there in the wall, they actually the little hooks that the animals would be tied to before they were slaughtered, and they would be slaughtered in that building that you see, which now houses apparently some porn studios, which are still like active, but I didn't know it at the time. So again, it's this sort of like a mixture of realities. And so here I actually got people to touch these metal rings and to really think about the embodied sort of history of the place. And next, please. Then there was like an intervention at one point where people would be taken on a guided, sort of blindfolded walk. So at that point they had to totally trust this guide that would escort them, and they would have about 15-minute experience of being blindfolded. It was like the feedback, because we've gathered a lot of feedback. We had about 100 people going through over the period of 4 days. That it really affected people in a strong way, because they would have to totally sort of give over their trust to somebody else. But it also enabled them to experience the place in a different way. And even people who knew the area very well would still find it very surprising and different. Okay, next one. So we had some people became quite adventurous there, and people actually really loved, and they got really into it. There was also a woman, there was like a very crazy weather happening. It was a lot of storms. So suddenly like a storm started, and there would be like rain pouring down and lightning, and she just didn't want to stop. So they carried on, and the weather, these conditions became part of the performance in a way. So again, this kind of non-human influences. If you can have the next one. These are just examples of some of these devices which reframe the point of view through these basic analog kind of means. Can have the next one. And then I got people also to walk across this open space. And what I wanted them to think about is their own imagination as a kind of augmentation of reality. Because the idea is that we sort of try to devise all these technologies, but actually we've got imagination, and that can augment things for us, and we can sort of, we can imagine what the place will be like, because this is an example of actually visualization from their website, because they are going to redevelop it. But I also wanted to think of people to think about the past. So if we can have the next slide. So that's the same space, just from the opposite direction, actually, of like how it was when the animals were there. Now it's somewhere in between the two. If we can have the next one. And here, again, this is like a street that looks like nothing much, but actually, through my research there, I've got access into the sort of inside and found that, so there's underground spaces that are not really accessible anymore, but also there are shelters, like war shelters there under the street. I don't know, I was not able to find out which period they're from. They might be like Second World War or Cold War maybe, but there's sort of everything there still as if frozen in time. It's very, very strange. So again, I sort of couldn't get people to go in there themselves, but I wanted them to know that it's there. So that would be part of the audio track, to sort of get people to imagine these invisible realities underneath. So the next one. Yeah, that's just one shot from there. Next one. And finally, so this was like a sort of final stage of this audio participatory walk, and I was very happy to discover this, because I've sort of knew it was there, ALSA, but I never actually thought that it would become part of my project. But once I walked in there, I just thought this is like absolutely amazing, because this is exactly what I'm trying to show here, that like this is the reality now. Now we're living in this sort of digital, shiny, brave new world of screens. Yet, you know, this is in a building where there used to be a laboratory where the animals were, like the disease was studied. One of the doctors caught one of those diseases and died of it. So there's this sort of dark, like visceral, biological sort of reality of our bodies and other sort of animal bodies. And now we've got this like a slick showroom here, as if somehow we tried to hide it all. So in that kind of state, people would then walk into it and through it. And if we can have the next one. So this is like from ALSA inside, and yeah, they've got their own stained glass windows. So it's like the new temple to technology. So I sort of wanted people to, and I think it worked, like the feedback has been kind of how I hoped that it had this effect on people, having sort of gone on that walk along the area. So the next one, I think and maybe just the last one. Yeah, so just to sort of conclude it all, and it's something that only occurred to me after I've done this project, even though it was always sort of implicit in it. I never thought about it as a political project. I'm not really a political artist, but actually I suddenly realized that if we think of like attention, our attention as a kind of commodity, the sort of most valued commodity in our times, in the age of attention economy, then to take away people's attention and sort of divert it into the overlooked, the sort of things that are not, you can't sell, that it's actually quite a radical thing to do, that it's actually a kind of radical way of trying to sort of get beneath the radar of the consumer society and sort of find a way to work with all these things that are in danger, such as imagination and, well, imagination mainly. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tereza, for sharing your work with us. Again, we come to the audience for a quick question.
I'm very sorry. I'm really sorry. I just wanted to turn on the bubbles. I don't even have a question. I just wanted to. So.
It was true, more than human affair. I actually have many questions, but I think that maybe it's better to go straight to the last contribution by Jaz, and then we have a little bit more time for the discussion altogether. But thanks so much, Tereza.
I've just got a list of things, and I can be stopped anytime. And I don't need to go through all of these. Please interrupt me. So, firstly, thank you for everything that's happening in the Ouroboros Festival. This is a distributed festival. I mean, imagine organizing this, and this has been amazing, and I'm super happy to be here. And at the same time, it pains me to think people I wanted to see here, and I knew they were coming, but they couldn't for many reasons. And that's just a small aspect of what's going on in the world, the immense trauma, violence. And for us to be sitting here to be talking about feral bodies and synthetic rituals, and I really thought about, like, what are we doing? But then perhaps it is precisely the time that we need to talk about these things. But, okay. So more than human, I think, emerged as one of the most used terms in the past few years. I have not measured it. I think it's often used than before, which I think is great. But at the same time, for me personally, my feeling is, so what? Of course. I find it interesting that when somebody says, did you know that we are only 43% human, the rest is just, microscopic colonies? That carries more weight in legitimacy than all these indigenous and subaltern cultures who have been for eons saying, for example, I'm a river. Why is that? And similarly, when it comes to AI, the algorithmic prediction carries and already asserts such weight in how the truth-telling about the future. And there have been all these shamanistic practices and cultures which are deemed illegitimate. And with my personal heritage, I'm also familiar with the notion that we're deeply and unequivocally part of, and we are just part of modern human, and that's it. So this recent interest is interesting, but I do celebrate it. I think we need to celebrate that. And actually, we are here already co-creating by living here. We're breathing, and think about all these molecular collisions that we're creating right now with all these holobionts, which are all of us, but also the soil, the champagne that I also finished, so no longer. This is like a sign. Can somebody bring me some? Anyway, but okay, so I'll just keep going. What are some of the... Thank you very much, that is love. But also shamanism and shamanistic practices and why it was valued. It was never about predicting the futures alone. Sometimes it took a form of predicting futures, but also healing, also performance, also just being there or eating together. And I think that was care. So I think we need to really notice and paying attention, as you're saying, where are the boundaries that we're sort of creating? What is being recast as legitimate and important in everything that we do when we are already living in the modern human world? And from whose perspective is this new and fancy, and where the funding is? Because there is. So even in these profoundly disorienting times, I am super glad that there's growing interest in modern human knowledge and data, especially as a creative practice researcher. And I completely acknowledge that I now live in Amsterdam, so the Netherlands, and before then Australia, in a very privileged academic position. But then it comes with good and bad things. Obviously looking like I am, talking about what I want to talk about and doing what I want to do. So I don't particularly want to talk about my own projects, also because it's not just my own project, it's always with a lot of people and a lot of other than humans, and a lot of them are dead. And how do we acknowledge all of those? But I think that's the kind of navigation that we need to pay attention to, and what I hope we'll be doing with whatever we do as more than human knowledge makers, at least part of those ecologies of knowledge and power. Research is really interesting. What even is there? Why do we even talk about it? Because we want to, but why? I mean, I would love to hear from the audience, like, why are you even interested in this subject, to be honest? But research for me, I mean, if you just do this fancy thing as, dash and research, and you keep researching for something, and there's this incessant hope, an incessant change, an incessant moving. And I think that's really interesting. So how do we do that? And why do we think about it? And how can we think about these complexities? Alone and together. But I think this researching creates spaces for new relations to emerge. And for me, that's the most important thing. Research, and we relate to certain things in different ways. And then these relations and these new spaces could really loosen the existing structures. And that's change. Small to big, that's change, I think. So that's movement, but then we think about movement, it's violent because it violates the form, the system, the whatever, yourself, the way of thinking. So then is it bad? But I don't think so. It's just a still form of care, I think, but it agitates sometimes. But how do we make sense of it together? I think that's the question, and I hope that is the question that we would like to explore together in our creative practices when we think about the more than human, whatever it may mean to different people. But we want to change. We want to see change together. Isn't that why we do this? I don't know, maybe not. But that's how I see it. So I just want to talk about one thing, and I'll just shut up because I would love some discussions, to be honest. But more than human, because it's really complicated. It's not non-human. And I think sometimes we sort of use that term to refer to multi-species. But it's so much more than that, more, It's bigger than us. And also sometimes we refer to that to talk about post-human and, technologies. It's all of those. But is this more than human? I don't know. Everything is. So I think that's why we really need to pay attention to relations. And for me, thinking through feral, which is the main theme of this festival, that's been super, super helpful. So just a quick background of the feral, from what I understand, because nobody also knows what feral is, but also like more than human, it's growing in popularity. So let's think about this together, I think. So for me, coming from Australia, originally from South Korea, but my first encounter with feral was in 2010. It was Genevieve Bell, who is an anthropologist and a futurist coming from Australia. She talked about feral data and feral technologies. And she referred to these forms of live technologies in human eyes. So in the 18th century, when the colonizers came to Australia, they brought in certain things with them, including camels, for example. It's a big country, Australia. There's these big deserts and everything, and they had to move resources that they, extracted through pillage and everything. So camels were brought in as a technology of mobility to carry stuff. But then when their perceived use value was expired because locomotives were introduced and more accessible, then they were kind of forgotten. Do you imagine, can you imagine what happens when there are living things and you kind of, I forgot. Are they dead? No, they're not. And they breed. There are a lot of them. You might forget, and humans did, until it affected their interest, mostly economic. Then what happened was they just introduced more technologies to cull them violently, chemical, shooting, whatever it is. And that was it. That's how, when they came back though, once they were super useful, important part of our lives, but then suddenly they were pests. Oof, I don't want you. And that was it. We fight them, we kill them off. I think it's still going on, and she's actually alluding to that. But they came back as feral creatures. Certain bits were familiar with, oh, we know how you go. Yeah, okay. Certain bits. But then when they just are being themselves, we go, I don't recognize you, that's woof. So feral is sort of in between space. Some familiar, some not. So there's always surprise. And we don't know how to deal with it, this indeterminacy and specificity. So we either kill them or we accept them. Because some feral creatures did thrive in other parts of the world. And data and technologies as well. Like think about QR codes, for example. How did it come back? Through COVID, for example. And Japan, before digital, there are these little robots serving tea. You know? And all these cultural elements, as Genevieve was talking about, they came back and they really affected how people imagine technologies. They are not here to kill us. They are friends. We can have delights with them. These things really matter when we think about anything, designing anything, creating anything, especially in more than human worlds beyond us. So I think that's super interesting. And so with feral, what's useful for me? On top of what Genevieve was talking about, this transformative potential of feral, because it's in between, familiar, but not. How do we work with it? It's not the other yet, you know, until we decide and kill them. Okay, maybe 3 things. Feral is useful for me in at least 3 ways. One is it provides a frame that allows for experimenting with more than human entanglements because it's so complicated, so much more bigger than us. It's so hard to make sense of it. So how do we, like Stengers would say, like common sense makes sense in commons. How do we do that? And I think feral provides this really useful, accessible lens. And yes, of course, we can use other terms like there's subversion, there's queering, all of those. But then think about all this more of sexualized mode of power that carried such profound importance in the global capital throughout the history. So it carries the baggage. But feral, for me, it's like, okay, it's quite accessible. Not to discard all of these discussions because they're important, but just a slightly different angle, perhaps, and more than human angle, including technologies and multi-species, all of those. So it makes it easier, perhaps, for me to work with other people with different ideas and different backgrounds and experiences. And the second is it demands me to continuously question the differential power relations within the existing systems. And that relates to the third point. It also encourages me to learn to deal with, as I mentioned before briefly, indeterminacy and specificity, which we really, really need to deal with, in fact. If we want to deal with more than human, we do, but it's so hard. But it gives me this little space to experiment with that. It's because feral is always in relation to something else. You can't just be feral. It's feral in relation to whom, and it's with specific proximity to something. It's feral to you. Camels were not feral to some people. They're beautiful animals. Even a family to other camels, you know? So we think about these things. What's feral here and now may not be feral elsewhere at other times. So that kind of richness that we really need to think about, these cracks that always existed that we just did not really bother to look at, and these cracks that we could open. And that's really helpful and useful for me. But there are specific challenges in thinking through feral, practicing in feral ways, especially, as I said, in this academic environment that a lot of us operated in as a practitioner and researcher, but practice-based or practice research. Legitimacy of knowledge, of course. The questions that arise. Is this a joke? You get questions like that. And how do you deal with it? And other things. but to do with legitimacy more than anything. What we do matters and we know it. As in, I knew that more than human existed always, but some people didn't. But in difference, we can find a common pathway. But I think creative practices really have that feral space potential more than anything, or any discipline or any field. So that's why I'm here, out of love. But one last thing, and I'll shut up. I just want to quote, so that's easy on me. Because when somebody says, is this a joke? Okay, this is, Lauren Berlant, whose work I just love so much. The joke can be seen, if it works, as akin to the form of good sex with another person. To work, as in joke or sex, to work means to achieve its aim of circulating explicit pleasure in a sociality that induces surprise, delight, being out of control, and a sense of a world that you want to be in. Even if for just a moment. It folds into the present, a quality that is not meant to be stretched out over every moment of the day or through the ordinary, but which, by virtue of its appearance, resonates in those other temporalities and conditions of life. So I think feral helps us to understand and really find ways to be with things that we don't understand, we are not even aware of, but remain open to the possibilities and be okay with it, at least, if not welcome it. I'll just stop here.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes.
Do you want to think more, or like? I have so many questions, but I will also try to shut up. We both have the same problem, and rather offer the space for questions to the audience. To any of the speakers, or you can also shoot very more like general questions, and one of us will take it, or we take it together. Someone, anyone? At least some bubbles. But if there are no questions, I have one pressing question, and that is a question about time, which is something that kind of, to me, seemed to be emerging through all of the 4 presentations. So whether it was just talking about the fact that it takes time to form relations, but also this time always emerges differently in different contexts. For instance, in the context of forming feral relations, or Tereza talking about the attention economy and the crisis of imagination, which is probably very much connected to the crisis of time, or humans not having time, actually, to even imagine. Or Maria Louise working with moss. There might be similar pH to human menstrual blood and the moss, but then the moss also lives on a different time and has different daily rhythms. It also doesn't bleed, same as at least some of the humans. Or Simone talking about generated content and the speed with which it actually comes about, which might be kind of like not approachable for us humans. So the risk sort of emerges from the speed with which algorithmic systems make sense of the world. So I wanted to ask, well, all of you, actually, all the speakers, if time is something that you kind of like came across in your work, or if it is kind of significant in your work, if you somehow relate it to the idea of the more than human time and the different temporalities of humans and other than humans. And maybe I would say, let's ask one of the online speakers, because you were a little bit, I felt like, not present in the room for the past few minutes. So if any of you feels like taking the time question. Don't fight.
I mean, I could give a fast answer to the time question. No, but there's several ways to answer this. But one I think that might be relevant to this is more that, on the one hand, the technologies I talk about seem to be situated in sort of a contemporary mindset. Whereas I think the way I use them, or at least I see them in my practice, is they're symptoms, or they're, something that emerges from a past, but talking about them in these languages of, for example, computer vision, makes them seem much more interesting and alluring, rather than if you're going to talk about, you know, like a taxonomic system that is deeply colonial, and it was implemented, and is at this point taken for granted. So I think time for me is more a very inherent question in how I can address someone and have a conversation about something that might be so embedded, at least in the sort of societies that I'm in, which are very sort of Northern European and Western. How do you make someone look at something again that they've been taking for granted? You know, possibly don't even realize the effects that it has. I mean, including myself, right? Obviously, I'm not part of any of that system. So I think time for me more becomes something that I realize is deeply embedded in the technologies, but they're not. They're very much part of that timeline. They're just the most recent sort of extraction of it.
Did you want to say something? I was just thinking of the research that's been done on like the sort of subjective perception of time and how the effect of technology, like spending time in virtual sort of environments, that it has on our perception of time, that it actually speeds up. So that's sort of, it's more like a philosophical sort of question for me that I'm interested in. And another, just a little point, I think if we're talking about non-human sort of, like species, like mosses or animals, I've just read this amazing book about how animals are sensing the world, and you realize that actually they are on a totally different time scale. Like whales, they actually like occupy a totally different temporal dimension, like physical and actually temporal as well. So I don't know how one bridges those sort of gaps.
I don't know, in Australia also, indigenous cultures, yesterday and tomorrow is the same, like, you know, past and future, and it's already there and we just didn't pay attention, I think. But also through Open Forest project, we think about data and how long they last and what does it mean, data then, you know, data that was stored in hard drive and is illegible, and for how long would they last? And all the time we're still fixated in the future that's apparently empty and we can make it. And, you know, with an understanding is somehow quantum computing will be the reality. But in the meantime, well, maybe, but in the meantime, people are dying and other creatures are dying. There are many issues that we could also look at. But also in a way that there's a belt, Zombiage. You can have a look at it and feel it if you like later on, but it's from Kamsa women in Colombia, and it has pictograms of, it's a storytelling also, it's a data, it's a record of things, changes in environment. So the particular bear that no longer exists, but if it's there and that belt would last for a long time, tells the story. And also we couldn't bring it, but Auntie Bronwyn, who weaving, but in a different way, creates data. She weaves eel trap, and okay, I have to shorten this story because this is going to be too long. She's a master weaver from Gunditjmara country in Australia, where Australian Indigenous cultures is one of the, well, actually the oldest cultures in the world. So their whole meats and everyday life, it all came from the volcanic eruption in Gunditjmara's country. So volcanic eruption led to this particular environment, geological environment, where ocean and mountain could meet, actually, with the pathways that volcanoes made. So eels could travel such a long distance, like up in the mountain. So what the people did then was to build around those pathways, natural pathways. And one of the things that they did was to weave these eel traps and using local plants. And eels could swim back and forth, not back and forth, actually one way. And only the big ones, adult ones, would be caught in these eel traps, and little ones could escape, because there are holes, obviously. And that's how they had this very resourceful and sustained life ways back in those days. But with colonialism, of course, came with farming and then industrial farming. So those waterways no longer exist, and eel traps are not needed. Nobody uses it really in practice to catch the eels. But Auntie Bronwyn is dataing in a way by going around and running these workshops, telling these stories, teaching people how to weave. It's not a pictogram like the Kamsa people's traditions, but it's the actual doing it, and we are being part of data, and that aligns very well with the oral traditions of this particular people. So I think that also shows us through this time, different temporalities, what is even data? Can we think about it differently?
So no, I just think that is an interesting question, actually. Because when Lenka asked me to participate, I thought, well, I don't what is it? What's data? What actually is it? And so it seems like that seems a really important question, because obviously, in what I'm doing, it's in artistic research, and I'm involved a lot in artistic research, and constantly sort of asking, what is it? What is artistic research? What is it to do with there's also a sort of emotional knowledge. There's a sensory sort of. Because one of the things about data, if it's data which is literally like a code or something that basically doesn't have emotional resonance for us, we don't connect with it. It doesn't affect us in ways that it should. So such as the climate sort of change issues. When it's just data, it doesn't have always this emotional effect. So again, I'm thinking of the role of artists as people who can kind of make this stuff less abstract and more concrete, because whatever, we still embodied creatures. We still can't escape totally in an abstracted world. So anyway, I'm curious what's data? Yeah.
And this is it's really good that you say that this was one of the motivations for the panel, actually, when we were thinking about artistic knowledge, and then we added the artistic knowledge and data to point this out, that as artistic researchers, we might have very different ideas of what data is. How can it look? We know it goes beyond digits very often for us, but then how do we actually work with data that tastes somehow, smells somehow, that we can touch, to engage with others? I think that sometimes there is, or very often there is this point of extra layer of justification and legitimization that we need to do in terms of communicating this data, for instance, through different publication formats, where it's kind of hard to present something that smells or tastes in a publication format, right? Because it's very text heavy. So this question of what kind of data do we produce through artistic research, and how do we actually share the knowledge through this data with others? It's an interesting thing to engage with, and I hope that we will still have more time at the festival to do this. But yeah, I think that this is one of the basically main motivations that actually started this panel.
I was wondering if that question, bring it up now, how we talked about before, ways of disseminating this knowledge, and.
Yeah, no, exactly, no, so that there is this term sort of, is it word overload or textual overload, that we are kind of over-focusing in terms of sharing knowledge on text. So actually I wanted to ask you also because of the tangible territory about that, because you probably have more experiences with that than many of us here. Is that something that you have been encountering as an issue also in your own practice as artistic researcher, sharing the knowledge that goes beyond text in various formats?
Yes, I mean, I suppose like moving image or video is like, that can do some of the work, because it can also be shared digitally. It still has the issue of the senses, the other senses that kind of get left behind, but I think that's the sort of division ultimately, is like it's the audiovisual media that can travel far and wide, and the proximity senses are actually very powerful, but we can't. So it's always going to be this sort of division between live events and these sort of mediated events. And I think I'm sort of curious, very curious what will happen with that as we shift more into sort of virtual spaces, that there might be a kind of also a need to come back to these physical spaces where knowledge can be sort of shared. Because I suppose, like, why did you come if you could have watched it online? You know, I think that's like, I ask myself, and I've got very clear feelings about it. Like, absolutely, it's worth coming if you can. Of course, sometimes it's not possible, and but anyway, I'm sort of waffling, digressing.
No, but this question of data, we can, and what it is, and how do we represent all these new relations, and what comes out of this new engagement with more than humans, maybe the people online might also want to answer to it. Perhaps Maria-Louise, in terms of the transition that you mentioned, Maria-Louise, are you there?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
yes,
still here.
In this transition that you made from Menses to Moses, in which it was working with certain materials to engaging with the more than human more intentionally within your practice. Like, was there a shift, or did you notice that you have to engage differently with your modes of knowledge production that you didn't notice before?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the motivation for the different relating, it was actually like questions of data, like digital data, because and what can be known about the body. So because I've been working a lot with menstruating body, lots of things are only considered known if it is datafied, which is some things that I've been like questioning, you know, like for instance, being sick or being diagnosed is only known if you're medically datafied in certain ways. So it's continuously been trying to like finding other ways of knowing, which is not through just a number, but through touch or through smell and so on. And I think the menstrual blood is interesting there. And then also through the relations with, for instance, mosses, where you have it with the pH, like how do you know the menstrual blood differently when it changed color on a red cabbage liquid
or through coming in relation with a piece of moss? So it's like a different way of seeing it or feeling it or smelling it that we try to thicken in different ways. And I think with the work with Nadia, we have done some exhibitions, and part of that has been a lot of like allowing people to touch things. We couldn't make people bleed on things because it's not part of ethical procedures to do that within our academic circles. But doing workshops where it's a lot of like talking, a lot of exploring together has been really important to share it, right? And yeah, so doing the workshops in that form has been really important. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially for those who are physically present here. And I think that Maria-Louise, did a very good sort of, at least pointed towards the closing of this panel, because we have a lot of embodied and tangible and multisensory events happening tonight and also tomorrow. And we are also running out of time, as as usual. So I would like to really thank you, all four of you, all the four guest speakers, for sharing your time with us today and sharing your experiences with practice-based research, and also thank the audience for your time. The audience both here and online on the stream. And I would also like to invite everyone here to join the performative lecture by Eric Peters that will be starting in, I think, 40 minutes. And then later we have the noise program by Schumacher and Obelisk happening till the late evening. So thank you everyone so much for being here, and yes, let's start drifting through the rest of the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for organizing the panel.